Here's how I refined this entire page with just one prompt using GPT 5.4. Yes, you heard that right. This whole solution page started with a single prompt and everything else was refined manually. If you look closely, the blue bubble is the only prompt I've used. Everything after was manual editing, adjusting, and refining the layout. Going into design mode doesn't cost you any prompt. So if you want to maximize your paid subscription, you should learn not to only rely on prompting. Now, if you're wondering how this was possible, the tool I'm using is called Aura. So Aura is really good at generating high-quality HTML templates, especially when you combine it with Gemini 3.1. But the interesting part of this workflow actually starts before generating anything. I like to use ChatGPT as my design assistant. So instead of prompting blindly and hoping for a good layout, I first brainstorm the structure of the page, like what section should we include, what story should the page tell. And after the first brainstorming session, ChatGPT suggested a structure of 6 sections for my solution page. So instead of writing a giant prompt and letting the AI guess everything, I did something different. I went into the component library and manually selected 6 sections to build my layout. And here's the interesting part. All of these components came from completely different design styles. They were not designed to match each other at all. First, I selected a hero component, then a solution by theme section to display use cases. For the third section, I picked a feature capabilities block, then another feature section explaining how the system works. For the fifth section, I added a testimonial and metrics component, and finally a CTA section at the bottom. So the page was basically assembled like Lego pieces from completely different templates. Now, for this workflow to work properly, there was one important thing. I had already designed 2 pages before this. The home page and the product page were both generated with Gemini 3.1. This is the home page, which I'm actually really proud of. Everything here was designed with AI by referencing components, injecting specific style, and refining the layout section by section until it felt right. Then I built the product page. It's less cinematic than the home page, but the styling stays consistent across the site. And reaching this version took about 20 prompts interacting directly with Gemini 3.1. As you can see, all these blue bubbles here where I was prompting with the model. Now, discovering GPT 5.4 Thinking mode was actually kind of accidental. During the past week, Gemini 3.1 and even Gemini 3.0 were extremely unstable. Every time I tried to generate something, the request would fail, most likely because of heavy demands on Google's server. So instead of prompting Gemini again, I started fixing the layout manually using ChatGPT. I simply pasted the HTML code and asked it to help refine the section. And that's when I realized something interesting. The GPT 5.4 Thinking model is surprisingly strong for design work. Yes, it takes a bit longer to respond, but it feels like the model is actually reading the entire file from top to bottom. When the first result came out, I was really impressed. So I decided to push it further just to see how far this workflow could go. So the first thing you want to do if you're using ChatGPT for this workflow is make sure you select GPT 5.4 Thinking mode. Before that, I always kept it on auto. And that was actually part of the problem, because auto prioritized speed, not depth. So the answers were fast, but sometimes inconsistent. But I avoided for a long time because it can take 30 seconds, sometimes even 90 seconds before you get an answer. The model is basically analyzing everything in the background before responding. But it turns out that extra time is exactly what makes it powerful. So make sure you're selecting GPT 5.4 Thinking. Now, here's the first thing I ask it to do. I gave it the HTML of my product page, which is the second page of my page template, and I asked it to analyze the entire page carefully, remember the styling, and treat that page as the design reference for the new page I was about to build, the solution page. So basically, the task was simple. Study the page, memorize the style, and apply the same visual language to the new layout. It took about 30 seconds before I received an answer, and the response was perfect. The model said it would use the current product page HTML as the style source of truth for the new page. In other words, it would inject the same design DNA into the new layout. That's exactly the behavior I wanted. Now, when I work with AI, I like to iterate section by section. This helps keep the result much more precise. One feature of ChatGPT that I use a lot for this is dictation. Instead of typing everything, you just speak naturally. Whatever comes to your mind, you say it out loud and ChatGPT converts it into text. This makes iteration much faster. After a bit of back and forth with the AI, I recorded a detailed voice instruction asking it to update the hero section while keeping the style consistent with my previous pages. And this is where the magic happens. GPT 5.4 doesn't just give suggestion. It extracts the exact section of the code, writes it entirely, and then tells you, replace your current hero section with this code. So all you have to do is copy it. Now we go back to Aura. Remember earlier when I said I mixed 6 different components together to build the first version of the page? Originally, I asked Gemini 3.1 to adapt those components to my style. But the result was still not perfect. Some sections were slightly inconsistent, the font were a bit different, the label didn't match, the color accent were off. So this was the first version of the hero section. It looked close, but you can still see some difference. For example, the label above the title was different, the font weight didn't match the other pages, and the color treatment on the second line was inconsistent. Inside Aura, there's something called code mode. This is where you can inspect and edit the HTML directly. Now, if you're a beginner and you never worked with code before, this can feel intimidating. You open the code and suddenly you're looking at hundreds of lines of HTML. You don't know where to start, you don't know what to change. When I first started using Aura, I never touched code mode. But over time, as I got more comfortable, I started exploring it. And eventually, I realized something helpful. When you click on a section inside Aura, the editor automatically highlights the beginning of that section in the code. So here, if I select the hero section, immediately the cursor jumps to the start of the hero section inside the HTML. Usually, everything is wrapped inside a section tag. If I select the second section, the cursor jumps directly to the beginning of that section as well. This makes navigation inside the project much easier. So here's what I do. I select the code starting from the opening section tag all the way to the closing section tag. How do I know where to stop? It's simple. If we go back to ChatGPT, the generated code ends with the closing section tag. So we copy the new code, replace the old hero section, and paste the updated version. Now watch what happens. Immediately, the title and subtitle become consistent with the rest of the site. The styling matches product page, the typography aligns perfectly, and all of that was possible simply by feeding the reference code to ChatGPT. So with just that single change, my hero section was already finished. And at that point, I was satisfied with the result. And the best part, no prompt was used because I was in edit mode. So from here, now that we've seen the workflow for the hero section, you basically continue with the exact same process. You iterate with the AI, go back and forth a few times, and ask for the changes that you want to see. Then once ChatGPT generates the updated code for that section, you simply copy it. So this is what I did for section 2. Then I repeated the same process for section 3. Again, once the AI gives the updated code, you just copy it and replace the existing section inside Aura. Then for section 4, I did the same thing again. And then the same process continues for section 5 and section 6. So we already saw the enhancement of the hero section. Now let's quickly look at the result for the rest of the page. For section 2, with the updated code, the layout becomes much cleaner. The structure is clearer, the typography matches better, and overall, the section feels much more aligned with the rest of the design. Then for section 3, I was already mostly satisfied with the original component. The only adjustments were mainly related to spacing. So the difference is quite subtle. You might not notice it immediately, but small spacing adjustments actually make a big difference for the final layout. For section 4, the changes were mostly about consistency. Make sure the title, the subtitle, and the text alignment match the styling that I established in the previous pages. Then for section 5, this is where the enhancement was much more noticeable. Originally, the style of that component didn't match the rest of the website. The typography was slightly different and the color treatment didn't feel consistent. So with GPT-5.4, I adapted that section so it uses the same color, the same typography style, and the same visual language as the rest of the layout. And finally, for the CTA section, I already liked the component itself. So the adjustments were mainly about refining the typography, making the font size, font weight, and color treatment consistent with the rest of the page. So this is basically how I was able to generate the entire page and make it visually consistent with the rest of my website. And the interesting part is that I didn't need to use any credit for each section. I simply leveraged the power of GPT 5.4 Thinking mode, which is included in my paid subscription. Before discovering this workflow, I used to rely much more on prompting, which means I was consuming my credits much faster. But with this approach, I can use Gemini more for the creative side part of the workflow, and then use GPT 5.4 mainly for iteration and refinement, especially when I provide a strong reference layout. I still haven't tested yet if GPT 5.4 is good at generating an entire design completely from scratch. That might actually be something interesting to explore in a future video. So if you enjoyed this simple workflow and found it helpful, make sure to leave a like, and I'll see you in the next video.